This lesson involves finding the area and perimeter of a rectangle. So before I continue, a really brief explanation of area. Area is the amount of space that something takes up, and in this case, it's the amount of space that a rectangle will take up. And the formula for area of a rectangle is length times width. On the other hand, you can think of perimeter as being the distance around the edge of a figure, in this case, the distance around these sides of this rectangle. And the proper formula for perimeter of a rectangle is 2 times the length plus 2 times the width. And what this formula is saying is that we can take a length, in this case we can take the length of 72, and we can multiply it by 2, because if we think about the properties of a rectangle, if this side is 72, then that means this side also has to be 72. And that's what this part of the formula refers to. Now for the width, we have a 27 up there, so we immediately know that there's going to be a 27 yards at the bottom. And that's what this part of the formula tells us. To actually find the perimeter of the rectangle, you can either follow this formula, or you can simply add up all of the sides of the rectangle, and they will both give you the same answer if done correctly. So for part A, they do tell us to use a calculator to find both of these values. So I want to encourage you to do that for these problems at least. To find the perimeter, we can use this formula, but I do think it's a bit involved if you're not used to using formulas. So we're going to go ahead and just add up all of these numbers using a calculator. So on a calculator, I'm going to type in 72 plus 27 plus 72 plus another 27. When I press enter, I end up getting 198. Now because this is perimeter, and perimeter just refers to the distance around something, if all of these are measured in yards, which they are, then my answer is 198 yards. When we move on to area, we find the area by following this formula up here, which is simply taking the length and multiplying it by the width. Now the length always refers to the longest side of the rectangle. So in this case, our length is actually going to be this 72. That means our width is going to be this 27. So when we're dealing with area, notice that there's no 2 L's or 2 W's in the formula. That means we can basically ignore these extra values that we wrote down because I don't want them to confuse me. Now all I have to do is multiply these values together. Multiply 72 times 27, and we end up getting 1,944. The only thing left is to write down our units. Now because area involves multiplication, we're taking yards and multiplying it by another unit of yards. That ends up giving us yards squared, so we want to have that as part of our answer. We're going to have yards squared. This exponent of 2, doesn't mean that we take 1,944 and multiply it by itself. We're not actually squaring that number itself. We're only putting that exponent, we're only putting this 2 on the yards. So we end up with 1,944 yards squared. And it's worth noting that in future problems, area is always going to have this squared at the end, whereas perimeter is never going to have that on the unit. So part B tells us that the field will be covered by artificial turf, and it wants us to pick what measure would be used in finding the amount of turf needed. So when you work these problems out, keep in mind that perimeter is only a distance around something, whereas area is filling in that space or the amount of space that something takes up. So if we're covering a field with artificial turf, that means we're filling it in, we're finding its area. Part C has someone walking around the field. It has Abdul walking around the field. So if they're going around a field, then we're using perimeter to measure that distance. For this problem, we're given another rectangle, and we're asked to find the perimeter and the area of the figure. So again, perimeter is just the distance around a figure, in this case the distance around the rectangle. Following the properties of rectangle, if we know that this length up here is 97, then we know that this length at the bottom is also 97. If this length is 76 feet, then we also know that the length on the right is also 76 feet. Now that I have all of my lengths labeled, we can find the perimeter by adding up all of the sides. When I add up all the sides, I end up getting 346 feet. Because it's perimeter and we're only working with distance, we're going to leave this feet alone. Now to find the area, we're going to take our length and multiply it by our width, because again, area is equal to the length times the width. So we can ignore those numbers that we wrote down at the beginning and just focus on these two and multiply them. When we multiply them, we end up getting 7,372. Now because it's area and the numbers are being multiplied, feet times feet gives us feet squared. So feet squared is going to be our final unit for this answer. Part B tells us that the court is going to have a wooden floor. So which measure would be used in finding the amount of wood needed? If they're filling in the floor with wood, then we're not looking around the floor, we're filling it in, which means we're looking at the area. For part C, it tells us that a strip of tape will be placed around the court. Because they're going around the court, we would be measuring the perimeter. This problem gives us a rectangular field. They give us 22 yards on the left, which means on the right, we would also have 22 yards. Then they give us 73 yards at the top of this rectangle, which means at the bottom we'll also have 73 yards. Now that I have all of my sides labeled, I can calculate the perimeter by adding up all of these sides. Because it's perimeter, we're only measuring the distance around the entire rectangle, which means our unit stays as just yards. To find the area of the figure, we need to follow our formula of area equals length times width. If we identify the length is just 73 and our width is 22. So we're only using these two numbers. And when we multiply them, we end up getting 1,606. Again, keep in mind that because area involves multiplication, length times the width, then we're really multiplying yards times yards, which gives us the unit of yards squared. Part B has somebody walking around the field. And anytime we go around an object, we're looking at the perimeter. And part C tells us that the field is going to be covered by artificial turf, which means we're filling in this rectangle. And anytime we fill something in, we are dealing with the area of that figure.